Hello, Hello, fellow coders. Today we'll be building our own forward auth middleware for traefik. If this is something you want to join in, come along to the whiteboard. Alright, so let's say we have our user making a request. The request is being handled by traefik as the ingress proxy. And traefik, depending on its definition, on its configuration, is forwarding that request to the application that is going to be finally handling the request. So far, so good. Now, introducing the auth middleware. The auth middleware is going to intercept the request and is forwarding it, hence the name forward auth, surprise, surprise, to whatever we define as a handler, as an application. We will just call this auth middleware for now. And this auth middleware is gonna handle our request, decide based on the contents of the request whether or not it is allowed to pass, and will respond to the forward auth request with either a HTTP 200 stating, okay, it's all good, request is allowed to pass, or let's say a 401 blocking the request, and the forward auth will just return the whole thing and the request will not be allowed to pass along to the application. Now, as a first step, we will be building the bottom thingy here, basically traefik and the application, which we will be using a whomI instance for. And once we have that all set up in Docker Compose, we will introduce the forward auth middleware and also build the middleware itself in, let's say, TypeScript running on bun. So follow along into VS Code now. Starting off, we will just do a bun init, which will just bootstrap the whole thing for us. We will have a tsconfig, we have a package.json, we have an index.ts. In the index.ts, there's just a hello world, which we can just test by doing a bun run index.ts. This definitely worked. Now for the container setup, we'll be using Docker Compose. Starting off with traefik as our first service. The image, the current one is v3.2.2 if I'm not mistaken. We will just state a container name here. The commands will be mostly shown, yeah. Looks correct. One thing I would always recommend is to not expose anything by default, just to be sure that you're intentionally exposing your applications to the world wide internet and not just by accident. We will map the port not 80 to 80, but we will map port 8080, which is not blocked on most operating systems, to port 80 within the container. So port 8080 on the outside to port 80 on the inside, which matches our web address here. And the last thing we'll do is we will map our volume. In this case, this is the Docker socket, which we will need for traefik to be able to introspect the other Docker images and see their labels, so traefik can deploy them accordingly, or to route traffic to them accordingly. Traefik is not actually deploying them, but it's looking at the deployed Docker containers and introspecting the labels to figure out where to route traffic to. Now, here we will be doing the whomI. We will use the traefik whomI image. Don't do this in production. Always pinpoint your images like so. Otherwise, you might run into updates on production without you knowing, which is definitely something you do not want to do. Then we will introduce the labels here. We will just use localhost for now, and port 80 should be the default also for whom for the deployment, but that should be fine for now. So now I'll just try to do a docker compose up, and we have our traefik up and running, and we have whom up and running as well on port 80 as promised. Now looking at the browser, we can see that here on port 8080 we have our whom page that is properly loading. Also the favicon is loading here. This will be important later on. And we are getting a reflection basically of all the things we're sending to whom back as this text output. You might be wondering, why is this authorization header foobar here? Because I configured it so. I have this header settings Chrome extension, basically adding the authorization header here. I can also deactivate that, and you will see this foobar is now gone, but I will just keep that as a authorization for now. Of course, this is by no means secure, but just for demonstration purposes, I think this is just fine. Now, with this setup up and running, we will start building our middleware, our actual middleware. For that, we will go ahead and do a bun install express as well as types express. Do the import express from express, have our application here, and just listen on that for a test case. That is working as expected. Let's see if the browser agrees. The browser agrees, and we have our hello world here. Now, with this base setup, we will go ahead and implement our forward auth endpoint. This is done by doing a get route, and you can name it basically whatever you want. I will just call it auth here. And now for request and response. Come on, we're in TypeScript. Let's do that properly. All right, so here we have our basic auth endpoint. Of course, we need to configure this endpoint. We will do so within the Docker Compose in the labels of the whom application. So basically the ingress that goes from the outside world, from the web endpoint here from traefik towards our whom that will get the middleware. The middleware is going to be configured here in the labels. And that will instruct traefik to actually first route the traffic to our auth middleware before routing it to whom So for that, we will do a traefik HTTP middlewares, and I will just call it forward auth. Type of the thingy will be forward auth. And the address in this case, because we are inside of a Docker container and our middleware is running on the host machine, will be http host.docker.internal. Port is 3000 and the context path, as we just specified, is auth. Now this is the definition of the middleware itself. This is by no means attached to whom at this point. To do so, we will need to tell the router for whom that we want to use the middleware forward auth at Docker. And now this middleware, which we just defined here, is also attached to whom and traefik is routing the request first to the middleware, and then if the response is positive, afterwards to whom. Now, one thing I forgot in the middleware itself, as it is right now, this request will never be fulfilled because we are not responding anything. We're just doing a log output, but we are not doing anything. So here we are now sending a rest status 200. And can we chain that? Probably we can chain that. We will just end the request right there. We will not send anything back, but the 200 status code. Now with that, we will just run our middleware as well as our Docker. And we will just have a look into the browser, what is actually happening here. So now we're calling localhost 8080. And we are actually reaching the application. Looking into the logs of the whole thing, we can see hello from auth middleware, not once, but twice. Why twice? Well, if we look into our network tab in the browser, we can see that we actually have two requests going to the server. One for the actual localhost page, which is the whom page, which is responding. The other one for the favicon, which is just a browser default, which is always being called. So next step is to actually check the request and to act upon it. So going back into our VS Code here, we will now introspect the authorization header. Request headers authorization, I think this is fine. And then we will do a if not authorization, so if we do not have any header, we will just end this right here. Otherwise, we will check what is within the header. If it is not foobar, let's do it like that. We will also say invalid authorization header. In this case, the user is, in my opinion, I think people can always fight about that, but in my opinion, in this case, we are not having a 401, but a 403, because there is a slight difference between those. Looking at 401, that's an unauthorized. Looking at a 403, that's a forbidden, according to http.cat. I think that's a trustworthy source. If we are past that, so if we're not returning here or not returning here, we will say, okay, valid authorization header. Authorized, bam. Now I'll just restart that and we will go into the browser and check what's happening. Maybe first we will do it without a header. So I've just set that to inactive. We're not sending a header along. Doing that will result in the promised 401. Now we activate the whole thing, but we are not sending foobar, but fizzbuzz. That results in the 403 as expected. And now we will do the foobar as a header, and we're getting that. And that's also what's being written here in the authorization header. So far, so good. Now, looking into the logs, we can see something very interesting. We can see first a log line, hello from auth middleware, valid authorization header authorized. The second one is hello from auth middleware, no authorization header present, which is very logical if we think about it, because just before we had two requests. First one was the request for the localhost page. For this localhost page, we are sending along the header, but the favicon request is not presenting that header, so that is actually being blocked here. Now, moving along, we can not only go ahead and act upon those header fields, for example, but we can also inject things. And this is where it's getting really interesting. So having the case that we are authorized, we can go ahead and have, for example, some user information that we sourced before, that we needed already for, let's say, authenticating the user and checking if he's actually allowed to access the resource. So now we can just go ahead and do something like const user groups is fizz and buzz, and those user groups, we can just inject them back into the request and they will be forwarded to the final application. So we can already here in a central entry point to the application set our group information, for example, which can then be leveraged by the actual application itself. For doing so, we will just do a response set header. X user group seems about right, and we will do a JSON stringify on the user groups. So this will be appended now. Checking so in the browser will reveal that this is actually not the case for a very specific reason. We need to authorize traffic or configure traffic to actually accept headers that are being injected by the auth middleware, by the forward auth mechanism. How can we do that? We can just label that on our compose here. What we will do is we will say, dear traffic, for the HTTP middleware, forward auth, we will accept the auth response headers. In this case, X user groups. And by doing so, we just instruct traffic to not just throw away everything the authorization middleware is presenting here, but it's actually accepting this specific header and is forwarding that to the application. I'll just restart the application here as well, jumping back into the browser. And voila, we have our user groups and they are present now in the final application. So now here in the back, we can have the headers that are being set by the authorization middleware. Just a grain of salt here. You need to be cautious with your header sizes. if you add that header, do not go crazy on it. You have a limit in some web frameworks of, I don't know, like 6 or 7K, stuff like that. So you cannot put a lot of data in there. Just be sure to keep that in mind and limit whatever you're doing to the required minimum. Let's say it like that. And that's about it. We've seen how to build our own traefik auth middleware, how to configure it using Docker Compose, and how to actually inject information in the authorization into the header of the request, making use of them in the final application. If this is something you liked, make sure to follow along. See you next time.